are now entering the horror sanctum.
Hello and welcome back to the Horror Sanctum podcast. I'm Jay with John and TJ, and today we are also joined by author, director, composer, writer, Mr. John Harrison. John, thank you so much for taking some time with us today.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
Hey, John. So I just first, thanks so much for joining. One thing I wanted to know, I was curious about is, I reached out to you through social media. And I was curious, are you new to Instagram and stuff, or had you dabbled in this before? I almost didn't know if it was really you at first. I thought, is this really John Harrison?
Yeah, I don't know myself, actually. It's like the short answer is yes. I really don't know much about social media except that I have a Facebook account, a Twitter account, a LinkedIn account, all of which have been set up really for the different things that I do. I don't really spend a lot of time posting about the thing I had for breakfast or what my cat did last night. But it occurred to me, and I'd been advised that Instagram was something that maybe I should pay a little bit more attention to. So I finally joined the 21st century.
That's great. I mean, I can speak for us and a lot of people. I mean, there's a lot of fans out there, horror fans, film fans, music fans who really appreciate what you've done. And that's
great.
It's just cool to see you out there. So I guess I wanted to start with, it's kind of a natural beginning for me, at least, with your career. How did you get hooked up with George Romero and that troupe? Because that it's kind of historical that group of people, they're almost like a family. Like it's like a family bond with the films, and they work together. What was that like for you, working with George and getting started with him?
Well, I'm from Pittsburgh originally. That's where I was born and raised and grew up there. And after I came back from school, I had a career for several years as a musician. I was on the road, and with the legendary guitarist Roy Buchanan. And I did about 4 years touring with him and recording with him. But I kind of always knew I'd studied theater, never went to film school, but I kind of knew that I wanted to have a career behind the camera. George, when I got back to Pittsburgh, it was really kind of an interesting time in Pittsburgh because there was enormous amounts of independent filmmaking going on, George being at the pinnacle of that in terms of theatrical features. But there was WQED Television, which was the big PBS broadcaster that was doing a lot of national programming. There was a video production house called TPC, which was it was one of the first real serious video production houses in the country. So there was an opportunity for all of us to really dip our toe in, if that's the kind of thing that we wanted to do. And as you said, it was a little bit like a family, simply because Pittsburgh being a small town, everybody knew everybody.
Right.
And so if you were doing a short film, or if you were working on a PBS show, you kind of knew the other people. And then when they moved on, you knew what they were doing. Anyway, two of my best friends, Pat Buba, who was a renowned film editor himself, who has, he was Al Pacino's editor. He was George's editor for many years on all of the big films like Monkey Shines and Day of the Dead, and had a great career. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. And my other friend, Dusty Nelson, we put together a film production company, a little film production company, sort of modeled after what George was doing with the Leighton Image. And we did industrials and commercials. We produced our low budget feature called Effects, which AGFA is now releasing in 4K HD. So those of you who don't have it, you can go get it. It's a limited release, so you might have to hurry up.
That's an underappreciated gem. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Definitely.
thank you, man. Yeah, it's thank God for home video and DVD, right? Because
Yes.
it had this limited theatrical release and then died an unnatural death, and then just became this kind of cult, mysterious favorite for years and years until we could finally put it out again. Anyway, we did that, and our paths crossed. George had a series of sports documentaries called The Winners, which he and his partner Richard Rubenstein were producing for ABC. And they called us up and came over and looked at some of our stuff and said, "Hey, man, why don't we work together?" And that sort of started it all.
Wow.
And we worked for George on those. And then his partner, Richard Rubenstein, called me and asked me if I'd be interested in being the assistant director on Creepshow. And of course, I I didn't know anything about being a first assistant director, but he said, "Oh, hey, listen, I just want somebody to be one of George's friends to be there on the set and keep things moving." And like I say, we all crossed paths on many productions. George shot Martin in Pat Buba's family home.
Right.
We were all in various incarnations of zombies in Dawn of the Dead. So that's just the way the whole thing started.
Yeah. You're the screwdriver zombie from Dawn of the Dead.
Yep, I'm probably more famous for that than anything else I've ever done.
I will say that, I know that with George's films, a lot of times now people look at Dawn of the Dead with Goblin. That's the iconic soundtrack. But
Yep.
I gotta say, I love Day of the Dead. I was listening to the Waxwork score a week ago.
Oh, what a great release.
Yes. And it just, what occurred to me about that soundtrack is that there's so much layer to it. Like each scene, you give so much character to the different scenes, whether it's Captain Rhodes or Bub, or like I hadn't noticed it before, but I was like, this is really a complex score. And I got to say, personally, I think it's his best. I think what you did there is the best score of any of his films, personally.
Well, thank you, man. John, it's funny you should say that, because when it first came out, of course, the movie wasn't that successful when it first came out. Now it's considered a classic. But when it first came out, it didn't do very well. And a lot of people did not like that score. A lot of people thought, "Wow, it's not a horror score. Where's all the creep and where's all the scares?" And, Creepshow was much more a traditional kind of scary movie score.
Sure.
Day had this kind of romantic element to it, which was kind of counterproductive given how dark that movie was.
Right.
But it really came out of George's original script, which we couldn't make because it was too big. So he kind of reduced it from what it was to the Cave movie that we all know and love now. But
Can
the
you speak
original
some
one,
to how much bigger, because that's like a lore now of like what did he intend to shoot?
well, it was a much bigger tapestry of characters and locations. It was set in a southern state, probably Florida. If you have ever watched Land of the Dead, the whole thing about Fiddler's Green was actually spawned in that original Day of the Dead script. That idea of a community that was isolated, that was walled off from the rest of the apocalypse. And it had a lot of sort of Caribbean themes in some of the stuff that George wrote. And so when I was creating the sketches for it, I kind of played into that a little bit. And George, I wrote him a kind of a temp beginning, and he loved it. So that when we ended up doing the shorter version, we ended up keeping those themes. And so, like you were saying, John, it was it was kind of layered to accommodate the characters.
Hmm.
But it was also a definite attempt to counter program, I guess, the darkness of that and allow for the humanity and the relationships, as well as the horror and the terror that was going on.
So when you're writing that, are you, and I know every editor, every director, composer, it's a different process, but are you watching the dailies with George and you're writing that? Or are you kind of just in your head thinking, okay, the script's calling for this. This is kind of the feel I'm going for. Like, I wonder what that process is like, especially
Well,
with Dave.
I have to say that I'm incredibly lucky, because as George's assistant director, I was on the set every day. So I was there from the beginning when he would first hand us the script, to when we were wrapping the production, to when we were going into post-production.
Mhm.
And so he and I would talk constantly in between setups about, well, it should feel kind of like this. And a lot of people don't know this, but George had an incredible musical sense, had one of the finest soundtrack collections I'd ever seen, all LPs. And he knew movie music a lot. And in his early career, he didn't have any money to buy or to hire composers or buy scores. And so what he would do is they would use what we used to call needle drops, or library music.
Mhm.
And you could go to Capitol Music Library and you could buy a bunch of cues for bupkis. And then, because he was such a good editor and had such a great musical sense, he would take these cues and he would cut them up. And he'd take 2 or 3 different cues and he'd make something entirely new out of them to fit his film.
Mhm.
So when I came along and we started working together, I had the advantage of becoming closer. Well, he and I became really good friends, and he was my mentor. And so there was a creative alliance that really informed how I could write. So, yeah, I saw all the dailies. I saw all the cuts. And in the case of Day, I was actually there entirely through post-production and temped the whole movie as we were cutting it.
Oh, okay.
So I would be downstairs composing and sending up tapes. Pat would cut them in. George and I would talk about them. I'd make revisions. So we had the whole movie scored before we actually went to the mix stage. And I went out to Los Angeles, or back to Los Angeles, went into the studio with my producing partner, John Sutton, and recorded it all again in a real environment, and then brought it to the mix stage. So I had one of those unique relationships that most composers really don't get a chance to do. Most composers are shown the finished film or a cut of the finished film,
Right.
and they work from that.
Yeah, it's tricky. I was reading something recently about William Friedkin was talking about The Exorcist and how he had like Bernard Herrmann take a spin at it, and he
That
wasn't.
would have been something.
Yeah, I know, and it's interesting. I mean, it's like the music is like the soul of a film, and getting it right, I just can't imagine what that process is like, because there's so many ways you can take something, and it's, I don't know, that's I'm not a musical person. I don't play music, but I'm very fascinated by that process and how you land on something that feels just right for a scene. So yeah,
Well, I love your comment about it being the soul of a movie, because it's one of those things that if it's done really right, it shouldn't draw a lot of attention to itself. You shouldn't be watching the movie going, wow, what a great score. But what you should be doing is being emotionally moved along by the music. I'm always fond of saying that music is as much a storytelling element as the cinematography, as the script, as the dialogue. It's right up there as the narrative element of a movie. And if it's done right, and if you're in the hands of great composers like Herrmann or John Williams or Jerry Goldsmith or any of those guys, then you're really getting the full measure of somebody's creative power in a movie like that.
Absolutely. And So I think this is correct. You did the theme for the Tales from the Darkside show as well, right? I know you directed a lot with that, but is that you, the theme to that show?
No. I cannot take credit for that. The theme for the Tales from the Darkside TV show is Donald Rubenstein.
Okay. I wasn't sure who did that. Yeah.
No, he did the theme, and it's iconic.
Very good. Yeah, I love those, a lot of those shows, Tales from the Darkside, Tales from the Crypt.
Yeah.
I know you worked on those.
Yeah,
Was that
Danny Elfman had a great theme for that.
All-time classic.
Yeah,
absolutely. When you were doing those and filming those shows, one thing now that a lot of people are curious about is, those were shot in 35 millimeter, right?
Crypt was. Darkside was not. Darkside was shot in 16.
16. Okay. I wonder, just because unfortunately now what we have is they were edited for TV. So what's out there is standard def. But do you ever hear rumblings or thoughts on, will these things be able to be remastered for film, whether it's, going back to the negatives where it's 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter, or is that just probably at this point not going to happen?
I can't speak to that definitively because those are business decisions that the studios make, and it really has to do with economics. I know that they've just released a new complete version of Tales from the Darkside. I have no idea whether they went back to camera negative or not. I kind of doubt it. I think they probably used whatever they had digitized from earlier releases and put that out.
Mm-hmm.
That's the version I have.
Yeah, and it's actually pretty good. I mean, I can't complain. It's actually pretty good looking. The Tales from the Crypt releases that I've seen look pretty good, but they were in 35. Now they were cut. We cut Darkside on film, and then did the digital transfers. Crypt, I believe, my memory serves, we shot it on 35, but we cut it digitally. So now with effects, for example, the movie that I produced back in the 70s with Dusty and Pat, the latest AG4 release, which is in 4K and 4K Ultra HD, they actually did go back to the 16 camera negative and reconstitute the entire movie from the camera negative. That's awesome. It's going to be gorgeous.
Yeah,
awesome.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and I own both of the complete series of both Tales from the Crypt and Tales from the Darkside, and
right.
And I know they were both standard definition and then transferred to try and upgrade, but I still think the Tales from the Darkside episodes look clearer. Those Tales from the Crypt episodes still have a little bit of grain in them, especially on newer TVs. So I do hope eventually we do get some good HD transfers.
Yeah, well, I have no idea where the camera negative for those shows even exists.
Yeah,
it's kind of hard to track that stuff down now. Darkside went through several ownerships, so I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, and sometimes those things can be. What's crazy is those things can end up in like a storage shed, and nobody even knows they're there. I know,
or worse yet, a garbage dump.
Right.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. Where we shot Day of the Dead was a mine in western Pennsylvania, a former limestone cavern.
Oh, wow.
And what it was used for was storage of a lot of Hollywood movies, the old prints.
Because there's supposed to be less moisture and something like that, right?
And cooler temperatures.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. So I'm personally a lifelong fan of all horror anthologies, that type of storytelling from the early days of like Dead of Night, like the Grandfather one in the early 40s.
Oh yeah, man. Yeah.
And all the great Amicus British productions from Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, Asylum, all those things. And then
Me too.
And in modern kind of history, if you ask most horror fans, they will claim that Creepshow is top of the line, the best, or it's in the conversation for the best for sure. I think it's probably the best one overall because it kind of bridges that gap between like those Amicus productions that were also based on the EC comics, Tales from the Crypt, Tales, The Vault of Horror, which I grew up watching on AMC back when AMC showed good movies. And but it had that DNA, but it had like a new, fresh sheen. You know, it had more of that comicness and the animated, you know, sequences in between the sequences and stuff. And you had at that point in time in 1982, you had like top tier star talent, which was new to the conversation. And anthologies, you know, with Creepshow kind of ushering that in, that kind of woke up a whole new era. For about 10 years, we'd been without horror anthologies in the conversation.
Well, it started with, obviously, the two masters putting their heads together and coming up with a great concept. I mean, you know, you can't do better than Steve King and George.
How did they meet and get together?
Well, Steve was a fan of George's stuff, and I think that George reciprocated when Stephen King became a well-known author. He loved his books, and I think that Richard Rubenstein kind of put them together at one point, saying, you know, we should team these guys up, and they got together and talked. You know, just the way I remember hearing about it is that they just got together up at Steve's place in Maine, I think, and were just talking about what movies they liked and this, that, and the other thing, and settled on the idea that, boy, they really used to love the EC comic world, and wouldn't it be great to, because George loved anthologies, and all the ones you were referring to, he had known about. He said, man, it would be great if we could revive that. And when we did it, he was adamant that visually he wanted to recreate the sensibility of the artwork of those comics, which is why we have the screen panels and the exacerbated lighting and all like that. And so
it's like a comic book come to life, and that's something that's unique to that movie.
That's right. And he gave each one of those stories a different visual signature, and it was up to me to do the same with the music. And so each score is completely different from the others in that anthology. And then, of course, we've got the wraparound theme music, but each episode has its own identity, musically as well as visually.
Yeah, totally. And I've always been curious, how did y'all convince Stephen King to do his one and only to this day starring role?
The best.
That happened outside my purview, but I think he was kind of intrigued by the possibilities. And now, I mean, can you imagine anybody else being Jordy Verrill?
Never.
No
way.
And I have to assume, because it wasn't that long after the success of Creepshow that Tales from the Darkside, the series, was kind of birthed. I have to assume that there was a relationship there.
There was, and I don't think I'm talking out of turn here. My recollection is that Creepshow, the idea of doing an anthology was based on Creepshow, but we couldn't use the title because Warner Brothers owned it by that point.
Gotcha.
And so George created Tales from the Darkside. And man, that was the best film school you could have ever gone to. I mean, we had to turn out a little story every week. Everyone was different. And George and Richard just gave us so much creative freedom to try and do great stories. It was just I could write them, I could direct them, I could do the music for them. I mean, it was just like, hey man, I can learn so much doing this.
And that was your first experience actually being the main director, right? For TV.
Oh, it was great. I mean, listen, we had no money, so it was, but of course we'd all come from the whole no money style of filmmaking.
Yeah.
And so that was not a shock. And it really was, what they say, necessity is the mother of inventions.
You also worked on Monsters, some TV
briefly.
series.
I wasn't involved that much. I came in and did some second unit and directed I was not involved in that series like I was with Darkside. I think
Sure.
I did 4 seasons of Darkside, I think.
Okay. Yeah, those are kind of always interesting to me, the outlier horror anthology shows that don't get as much attention. Like I know there's also Nightmare Cafe. You briefly had some things related to that.
Yeah, boy, I wish that had gone on longer. That had some Wes and his son Jonathan had a really great idea there, and it could have really worked, but it
Yeah.
was short lived.
Yeah, it just went one season, I think.
Yep.
Mhm. Yeah, there's so many of those. I think now I'm glad they brought Creepshow back for Shudder. I know you've worked on that. I'm really glad that's kind of come full circle. Horror
They've been a lot of
anthologies.
fun to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I'm so glad that's revived. Some of that stuff got so lost in the 80s, and there was that transition period. With
Well, we've been
working,
very lucky, I have to say, to have Greg Nicotero as the executive producer because although he was not involved in the original Creepshow, he came on with us as a young guy with Day of the Dead,
Mhm.
and then with me on Tales from the Darkside, the movie. But he was insistent upon honoring the style, the look, and the feel of the original Creepshow, and we've been able to maintain that. I think that's why it's successful.
Oh, okay, that's great. Yeah,
Absolutely. So, how did you get to? Was it just because you'd already done like 8 episodes of Tales from the Dark Side, the TV show, to be able to direct the film, or did George come to you specifically?
Actually, Richard was the one that got me to do that. But yes, because I had done so many of the Dark Side TV shows, I guess they thought, well, he knows how to handle the material. And we had 2 production teams, one in LA and one in New York. I did most of my work in New York, LA, but Richard brought me up to New York because that's where we were going to do the movie. He wanted me to do an episode or 2 of Dark Side TV in New York with that team and see how all of it worked out. And yeah, so he gave me the shot. I mean, George endorsed it. George was part of all that, but
Yeah.
Richard was the one that really put that film together, and I was lucky enough to get the shot.
That's awesome. And that was a whole another kind of early 90s renaissance of a lot more horror anthologies to be made. But I think the Gargoyle segment is just as good as any segment on any horror anthology film or TV show. That's I mean, I go back to all of them for that film, and I rewatch that film probably about once a
Well,
year.
that was one of my favorites too. I love the story because it is a horror story, but it's also a romance.
Yeah, there's a
And
pathos to it. It's like a
that's
myth.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like mythological, like you say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, Radon Chong and Jamie Remar just hit it out of the park. I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better cast. I had an unbelievable cinematographer that I've worked with since. He's doing the new Creepshow TV series, Rob Draper, and we really created with that whole movie. We did the same thing as in Creepshow. We gave each story its own identity visually, and Rob was the major part of all that. But Lover's Vow really had a very kind of interesting look and feel. And then, of course, Greg Nicotero and the K&B boys, Howard came up and invented all the gargoyle stuff. It was fantastic.
Did you ever think going through your career, like starting working in, even doing the little stuff you did in Dawn and then working in a lot with more with Creepshow and Day of the Dead? I know this is probably something you've been asked before, but as you're going through these projects, does there ever that moment where you're on set and you're like, this is really special? Like there's something about this is going to live on. Or are you just kind of like, it's a job, I love it, but let's just see how it goes because it's legendary now. It's the zombie,
Yeah, well, I'll tell you about that. We would never have thought that back in the day when we were making these things. Dusty and I laugh our asses off all the time when we think about effects being put out for the
Mhm.
third time and continually re-released. I mean, it's one thing with George's movies because George is George, but had we even said back then, Creepshow is going to be this legendary movie that has spawned all this other stuff and so forth and so on, we probably would have said, well, okay, we'll see. We took it very seriously. I don't want to minimize how
Sure.
hard we worked. There was no let's phone it in or this is just low rent stuff. No, we treated it as if they were A-list movies. But if you would say to me, you're making the movie and in 50 years it's going to be this iconic thing, well, if I'm around in 50 years, maybe I'll get a chance to see that. But I would never know that. We were just having fun, man. And as I said earlier, when you're young and starting out like that, it's kind of like, I can't believe we're getting paid to do this. It's just like, this is the kind of shit we love, man. And it's like, wow, we're getting.
I think that it translates when you're having fun too. Like when you're watching it, when you're watching anything, you can kind of tell when the crew and actors and everything are having a good time. It definitely resonates on film for sure.
I think you're right, man. I definitely think you're right. You can really tell when a movie has the TLC behind it.
Totally.
But the only film, the only project that I've worked on where I've thought, well, this could be quote unquote important was when I did the Dune miniseries, and that's partly because Dune was such an iconic book anyway.
Frank Herbert.
That I had to really, I had to buy. I mean, I loved it, and I was thrilled that I got the chance to adapt it.
And it won an Emmy, your adaptation, right?
Yeah, it won a couple of Emmys, both of them, both miniseries. But I had to really buy into the significance of the project because I knew how important it was for all the fans.
Yeah. What do you think of the 1984 David Lynch adaptation?
Well,
it's very polarizing.
Yeah, as a filmmaker, I admire him enormously. There were things about it that I thought were absolutely gorgeous. There were things about it narratively that I was disappointed with, and partly that's not his fault because it was taken away and recut and blah blah blah. We all know the story. So when I got a chance to do mine, it was really not trying to do anything in either relationship to it to better it or change it or whatever. It was a whole different animal.
And you got to be an executive producer on the recent remake?
Denis Villeneuve's movie. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think the success of the Dune miniseries kept the idea alive or revived the idea that Dune could be adapted because unfortunately, David Lynch's version kind of soured a lot of people on that being translated to film. But the success of the miniseries made people think, well, wait a minute, maybe we can. And it turns out that after we finished those miniseries, there was several attempts over the years to try and come up with a theatrical version. And Richard Rubenstein and I were involved in those tangentially. I mean, we were not a part of any of the production of the current one. It's by the grace of our previous miniseries that we're associated with it at all. But I think he's done a fantastic job.
Yeah.
Totally. I'm really looking forward to this next one.
Definitely.
Yeah, for sure. And before we switch gears and start talking about your book that you have upcoming that we want to hear about, I just have one last question kind of in the movie realm is how did you get connected with Clive Barker and some of his work, probably most notably the Book of Blood that you did directed in 2009?
Well, I knew a producer in Los Angeles, Jorge Saralegui, and who was at Fox, and then he was at Warner Brothers, and he and I had crossed paths several times trying to get projects going. And he came to me one time and said, we're putting a new company together to adapt Clive's Book of Blood short stories. We're going to try and do a series of films. And I said, listen, man, I would love to do one. Give me one. Let me have one. And so what I pitched him and Clive was taking the opening and closing. I don't know whether you're familiar with them, but there's a short story at the beginning called The Book of Blood, and then there's one at the end called On Jerusalem Street.
Mhm.
And they kind of bookend the collection of Clive's stories. Now, Clive and I knew each other because I adapted his Abarat books for Disney at one point. Fortunately, it never got made, but he knew who I was. I knew who he was, obviously. And so when this opportunity came along, they gave me a shot to do the adaptation. And the company in England that was the producing company, Matador, loved my script, and that's how we made Book of Blood. And Clive was involved in that. He wasn't there for the shooting so much, but we talked about my script, and he came over and actually was very much involved in the design and the execution of all the ghosts at the end and their look.
Okay, very cool.
He was
Now-
a great collaborator, brilliant guy.
Yeah, still very brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So tell us about your book. I believe it's scheduled to come out August 15th, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Well, this is what happens when there's a pandemic and a guy has too much time on his hands. I had another book earlier that I wrote called Destiny Gardens, which was a story that I was carrying around for a long time, and then decided, well, it was supposed to be a film idea, and I started writing a treatment for it and realized, oh, this is really turning into a narrative story, so I might as well finish it. And the same with Passing Through Veils. I've had this story for a while. I've noodled it as a film. Never got a chance to really try and put it together. And when I had some time, I just started writing it, and it came. It just was one of those stories, I guess because I'd been thinking about it so much.
Yeah.
And it's a story that I love. It's the kind of thing, the kind of psychological thriller that I love. It's very much in the vein of Shirley Jackson. And so I just went with it. And fortunately, my friend Kevin Anderson, who owns Wordfire Press, wanted to publish it. Kevin is, of course, New York Times bestselling author in his own right of many, many books, and just a wonderful guy and a great publisher to work with, I have to say. And so we're putting it out. It'll be out. It's available for pre-order now at Wordfire Press, but it'll be out in August. And I'm pretty proud of it. It actually turned out really well, and I had a lot of fun doing it. Some people say, well, you work in music and you work in film, and now you're writing books and so forth. And to me, I don't find, they're just different media for what I do, which is storytelling.
Yep.
I consider them all to be storytelling. And that's sort of what I've thought of myself in my career, such as it is.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's definitely.
And it's a very cool, twisted, gothic, psychological thriller.
All right.
And you're never really
veering
sure
towards horror a little bit, or
yeah. There's some crazy stuff that happens. You're not really sure whether it's in her mind or whether it's really happening. And
a little turn of the screw type action there.
There you go. Yeah, definitely.
Did you enjoy doing that more than you have directed at all?
Oh, I can't say that.
Different animals?
They're two entirely different animals. When you're writing a screenplay or a book, you're sitting alone in this room and you live inside your head. I love directing. I love being on the floor because it's a collaborative meeting, and you're working with other artists who, if you're lucky enough and you're all pulling in the same direction, you all have that same enthusiasm and love for what you're doing. And the ideas are bouncing back and forth. And I love to collaborate with people on that. I am not, the auteur director that it's my way or the highway. I will take a great idea from anybody.
Awesome.
And I love that process. But I also love sitting here by myself and just thinking up what's going on in my fevered imagination.
You mentioned Clive. You were helping Clive Barker get something on Disney, which blows my mind. Him on Disney, but it segues into my lonely question before we close up shop. When you look at your past works, there's one thing that really stuck out to me, and that was 2000's Dinosaur.
Oh
Yeah.
From Disney. You were, I guess, you helped co-wrote that. How did you get involved with that?
Yeah, because it's kind of like which one of these is not like the other?
Yeah, exactly. That was a kind of a circuitous path. They came to me initially and asked me to do a version of the Time Machine. They wanted me to write a story for an animated time machine. And because I was sort of in the horror suspense thing, they thought, well, this could be kind of cool. So I did that, and it didn't work out. And they said, well, we still have you under contract and this, that, and the other thing. We can either, give you the rest of the money and you go away, or you could come over and help us with this other movie. I said, well, what is it? And it was, well, it's this dinosaur thing. And I thought, well, we'll see. But of course, I had little kids at that point. And of course, they thought that was a very cool idea. So I went over and got involved. And it was a wonderful experience because the way they write at Disney is they don't write, they draw. So they're telling the story with images, which is just such a fascinating thing because I can't draw at all. And so working with these animators in the room for whatever it was, 8 months, 9 months, was just, I loved the experience. So that's how I got involved in it.
Cool. I actually just bought it about 2 weeks ago. Is it a thrift store? And before, I knew anything you had done, like I didn't know you did that at all. So it's kind of funny. I haven't seen it in years, but I know it's fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. So, but that's cool. So, all right, that's going to be it for this episode. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page and to where you're listening to us now. Follow us on Instagram for our tireless reels and behind the scene pictures and whatnot that do sometimes make me tired. And thank you, John, for taking some time with us. Be sure to check out his book, Passing Through the Veils, which comes out August 15th. And, again, thank you so much for taking some time with us. It was awesome.
Great conversation, guys. It's been a lot of fun with you guys.
Thank you. All right. So
yeah, thank you.
For John, TJ, and Jay, until next time.
Keep it spooky.